Yesterday, President Biden announced that he hopes to overhaul the Democratic primary process by changing which states go first. He claims this is in the name of diversity, but we'll tell you the real reason behind the change. First, some context. President Biden and the Democratic National Committee are moving to radically reorder the party's presidential process by making South Carolina the first primary state starting in 2024, followed in order by Nevada and New Hampshire, Georgia, and then Michigan. Here's what Biden said. We must ensure that voters of color have a voice in choosing our nominee much earlier in the process and throughout the entire early window. Biden wrote in a letter Thursday to members of the DNC's Rules and Bylaws Committee, a number of whom were stunned by the calendar proposals. Black voters in particular have been the backbone of the Democratic Party, but have been pushed to the back of the early primary process. We rely on these voters in elections, but have not recognized their importance in our nominating calendar. It is time to stop taking these voters for granted and time to give them a louder and earlier voice in the process. The New York Times reported on this story, and to their credit, they did a good job of spelling out what is actually going on. The plan represents an effort to elevate the diverse working class constituencies that powered Mr. Biden's primary victory in 2020. The move would also be a reward for South Carolina, the state that saved Mr. Biden's candidacy 2 years ago after he came in 4th in Iowa and 5th in New Hampshire, both of which are smaller and have a higher percentage of white voters. In other words, Biden wants the states where he performed better to matter more. Is that an indication he's running in 2024? You read into it as much as you'd like, but it's already. But at the same time, I do think some change in order. It is a pretty messed up system too. I know, Cenk, you and I see it a little bit differently. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it first.
Yeah. So I'm curious what Ben and Mondale think of this, because this one's complicated. So on the one hand, it is great to hear from African-American voters, a state that has way more African-American voters, especially in a Democratic primary, a little bit earlier in the process. Now, South Carolina is number 4. It's not like number 37 or anything like that. And Super Tuesday, South Carolina and Super Tuesday pretty much decide who's gonna be the president anyway. And Super Tuesday is loaded up with southern states with heavily Democratic primary voters that are African-American, right? But they're trying to move it up even further to get the knockout punch quicker, okay? So now diversity is great, so that's the upside of this. The downside of this is conservative Democrats do better in states with a higher percentage of African-American primary voters. So we can get into why, we can get into how can we change that, but for the moment being, that has been true for Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, you name it, except of course Hillary had the issue of running against Barack Obama. And that wound up throwing a monkey wrench into her plans in 2008, but then she did use it effectively against Bernie Sanders in 2016. So establishment Democrats think, oh, this is perfect win-win. It'll look like we care about minorities, but in reality, all we're doing is arranging their schedule so that we have an even bigger advantage against progressives. So it's definitely self-serving. That's their hearts going out to minority voters is priority number 183. Them winning the primaries is priority number 1. Don't get it twisted as to why they're actually doing it. They had all the time in the world to make this change before, but it wasn't as clear before that it was a huge advantage for the establishment Democrats. And now that they see that it is, that's why they're changing the calendar. But it could still be the right thing to do. So for that discussion, Mondale, why don't you start?
I think it's a complicated situation for me. I absolutely know that the establishment Democrats are thinking this is a benefit for them. And in a couple election cycles, it might be. First of all, we know that this is not about diversity. This is absolutely about them winning primaries and cutting off progressives, for sure. However, what we do also know is investment in voters increase the likelihood that these voters will participate. So what we're going to see eventually in South Carolina is more Black Democrats participating in the primary, meaning we'll get more progressives. I would argue that the reason conservative or just conservative Democrats do better than progressives is because of those who participate in the elections. I wouldn't say that Black Democrats are more conservative than any other Democrats. I actually would say the opposite, especially when we're talking about issues about expanding rights for people, especially Black people. So if the Democrats really cared about diversity and Black people's votes being heard, Mississippi would have been the first state, right? It's the blackest state in the union, and also they've been unheard. I don't really think that the primary should be more representative of the country. I think the primary should be representative of the party. And in thinking about that, then we have to say that Iowa was a mistake 50 years ago and right now. And I think, so what I do know is research after research, election cycle after election cycle always says the more money you spend on voters, the more likely they are to vote. So what's going to happen is it's going to actually a couple election cycles, and this is going to backfire on the establishment, and we're going to see progressive younger voters in South Carolina picking more progressive candidates in the primary, and that's going to be a wonderful thing for all of us.
I still think this is a net positive because, yes, that might be the case that because of the disenfranchisement of black voters in the primary process and the caucus process, they didn't come out in bigger numbers. But Iowa and in New Hampshire, both the first two states, one caucus, one primary, they tend to come out, voters in general, and take it much more seriously and come out in much larger numbers because of the responsibility they have and the feeling that they have that they are influencing the outcome. They're influencing who the front runner becomes, and that is a power that I think any community would be very happy to have and might activate voters. As many of you may know, I ran for president of the United States, and you have to spend so much time in Iowa and New Hampshire, and Iowa is a caucus state. I'll get into that in a second when I tell you about how Biden wants to get rid of the caucus process as well, but it's very convoluted, it's very complex. You have to spend your time kissing the ring of as many of 99 precinct chairs across the state with long drives in between and try to get them, all white people, to get on board with your message, and you're losing that time speaking to a more representative demographic of what the country truly is. And I think that's important, not to mention the caucus process is a complete mess, as you remember in 2020, how badly they messed up counting the results of their caucuses, and we knew it was coming with this new phone system they did, and they kind of lost the right to have that spot, I think, as well. But I just think in general we need to reflect the country more in who comes out of the gate strong as a potential front runner in the presidential campaign, and not just because it would have been better for me.
So now a little bit more context too. If they were serious about getting more minority representation, they would also be very adamant about moving Nevada up. Now Nevada's third anyway, right? But you could, if they're moving South Carolina, that's fourth to first, you could move Nevada to second, for example. But Nevada's heavily Latino, and they, for whatever reason, vote more heavily progressive. So they're like, no, we're good with Nevada. Okay, so I mean, it's obvious, it's super obvious. They're just trying to get an advantage for the establishment candidates. And so now on the caucuses, progressives do great in caucuses, and there's a reason why, okay? And this one's also nuanced and complicated. The reason progressives do better in caucuses is because they're more passionate, so they're more likely to show up to a caucus, which is a giant pain in the ass. Whereas establishment Democratic voters heard some pulp on MSNBC and heard that progressives couldn't win, and that we had to vote for the conservative Democrat, otherwise Trump would win. So they're like, okay, they're more casual voters, and they go in and vote. The caucus guys are more into politics. So anytime there's a caucus state, Bernie Sanders and progressives had a big advantage. So that's why they're like, wait, Biden cares so much about diversity, and that's why we're gonna move Iowa down and move South Carolina up. Okay, so far that's at least logical. And that's why we're gonna get rid of caucuses. But wait, what does that have to do with diversity? No, all of this is 100% an effort by Joe Biden to make sure he doesn't get primaried and lose a primary. Okay,
sure.
So that's the reason for it, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong, because Ben's right, the caucus process is very complicated.
And the caucus process also makes it harder for smaller candidates. So just because it's peer pressure. You don't get to actually vote a blind ballot. You literally have to, how it works is you stand in a room and you say, stand in this corner if you're for my candidacy, stand in your corner if you're for Bernie Sanders, Biden. And people have to then go and be convinced and move around. And that's much harder for candidates who are trying to buck the system and break through to do so when there's not a blind ballot. And I think that makes it a lot more challenging and a lot easier for just establishment candidates, whether they are progressive or conservative, on the Democrats' side to come through. There's a little bit more we can talk about here. So Biden wrote a letter also to the DNC saying our party should no longer allow caucuses as part of our nominating process. And of course he wields a lot of influence in making these changes, but the affected states are not happy, and it remains to be seen if they'll be implemented. Small rural states like Iowa must have a voice in our presidential nominating process. Democrats cannot forget about entire groups of voters in the heart of the Midwest without doing significant damage to the party for a generation, said Ross Wilburn, the chairman of the Iowa Democratic Party. I strongly oppose the president's deeply misguided proposal. Make no mistake, New Hampshire's law is clear and our primary will continue to be first in the nation, said Senator Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire. And they're just bucking it. They're saying no matter what gets decided by the DNC, the states can still do what they want and they're gonna still be the first primary. And so we'll see how that shakes down. Nevada State Senate Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro and Nevada State Assembly Speaker-elect Steve Yeager, both Democrats, released a joint statement refusing to move their primary date from Tuesday, February 6th to meet the Biden plan. We strongly disagree with President Biden's proposed new order of early presidential nominating states. They said in the joint statement, we are the right long-term choice to be first in the nation. So they're trying to get that #1 spot as well. We'll see how it shakes down, but I don't know, I think some changes in presidential politics wouldn't be for the worst.
All right, last thing I'll say on this is that, look, Nevada could play the same identity politics and go, oh, that's it, you're dissing Latinos. Okay, it's a heavily Latino state in the Democratic primaries, and that must mean that Democrats hate Latinos. Of course not, right? And by the way, I generally agree more with the Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada delegations. That doesn't mean they're not biased either. Of course they're biased. They want to be up earlier because it gives more power to their states. So understand everybody's different interests and then make a rational decision, you would hope, at least for yourselves and what you think is the right thing to do. Then you make a rational decision as which one you want to support, given that there are good arguments on both sides here. Everybody's biased, but there are valid points that Biden and the others are making. And then finally, my message to progressives is this: is the same as to Republicans. Republicans go, oh my God, they're bringing in all these immigrants so the Democrats can win. And I say to Republicans, well then why don't you just win their votes? Right? Why are you assuming they're all gonna vote for Democrats? Why don't you have policies that are better, right? Now, I'll say the same thing to progressives. In the case of progressives, their policies are not the issue. And I can prove it to you. In Mississippi, for example, as Mondale just said, they're the most heavily African-American state. 65% wanted Medicare for all. That's in an exit poll in the last presidential primary, right? So they obviously voted for Bernie Sanders, right? Nope, 78% in favor of Biden. Now, so progressives weren't wrong on the policies. They've got all the policies that African-American voters want. Their problem is in communication. And I know it's super difficult to get past the wall of propaganda that is corporate media. So mainstream media will take that and go, now remember everybody, if you like Medicare for all, you vote for Joe Biden. And we're like, what? Joe Biden's 100% against Medicare for all. So, and remember everybody, Bernie Sanders has a 0% chance of winning. Make sure you vote for Joe Biden, who's the only person who could beat Donald Trump. I know, so progressives, you know what? Figure it out. Figure it out, get better, okay? Get past the propaganda and win African-American voters. And when you do, then you'll have the entire Democratic Party.
Paid for by the American Petroleum Institute.
Yeah, I would also say just a gentle pushback on some of it. The fact that like I don't think that our Latinx brothers and sisters are more progressive than our Black voters. And what happens is, if you look at how we vote in general elections versus who's voted in the primaries, I think that's what happens. What happens in the primary is you tend to have older voters voting. When you see younger voters participating, young Black voters are as progressive as any other voters, if not more progressive. We saw this pan out when we saw Black men outperform every demographic for support for women's right to choose at the Supreme Court, the leaked document from the Supreme Court. Even every demographic of women in this country. We also know that in general elections, we see our Latinx brothers and sisters vote somewhere around close to 50% for Republican candidates. That's a huge signal that they're not as progressive as Black voters. But I will say that there's some truth in what you're saying, that there's nothing other than pure establishment trying to protect itself in this move, and the caucus, trying to get rid of the caucus, says that more than anything else. And I think if we are upset what happened in Iowa caucus, then we figure out how we fix that. I do think there's some truth to what Gleek was talking about when he said, if you are a smaller candidate, not in statute, but in finance and resources, then you're gonna have a hard time winning the caucus because of the amount of work and resources it takes, which is why people are in Iowa a year before the election. So I think and another thing about Bernie, as a guy who is a Bernie guy, I'm talking about myself. What happened in the last presidential election with Bernie in the primary cycle was Bernie took the 4 years in between 2016 and 2020 to spend all that time in Nevada, building up his base in Nevada instead of going to South Carolina. And I don't know if you all know it or not, Black people are not really interested in finding another old white man to yell at them. So when Bernie came to South Carolina, Joe Biden had already had the Obama swag on him, attached to him. So that was something that Black people didn't have to learn about Joe Biden, whereas Bernie didn't have 4 years of relationship already built in to Black people in South Carolina. Also, people like to give credit to Clyburn. Clyburn is not a Black person whisperer. Black people in southern states didn't vote for Joe Biden because of Clyburn in South Carolina. Black people, I would argue, throughout southern states don't know who Clyburn is, but for those who are committed to the party and the primary system already. Majority of Black people don't care about what Clyburn has to say, even in his district. And you can tell about the number of Black men and Black people who sit out elections every cycle and choose not to vote for him.
Yeah, I just want to say one last thing because I don't want to be misunderstood. I think Mondale makes a terrific point about the age demographic. The reason why you saw the results that you saw in 2020, where Latinos voted in higher percentages for the progressive candidate, Bernie Sanders, is not necessarily because Latinos are more progressive. No, African American voters, if you look at the policy positions, are very progressive. And again, the media skews how they perceive those issues, et cetera, as we discussed before. But it's the age. Latinos are younger on average, and younger people are tremendously progressive. And a lot of the African American voters, since they are such solid voters, they're like the best voters in the country, are older voters, and older voters unfortunately watch television, and that's why they get that propaganda. And that's why they tend to vote for the more establishment candidates. So it's the age thing that makes a difference, much more so than race.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.